بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah writes, وَتِلْكَ الْكَثْرَةُ أَحَدُ شُرُوطِ التَّوَاتُرِ إذا وردت بلا حصر عدد معين بل تكون العادة قد أحالت تواطؤهم على الكذب وكذا وقوعه منهم اتفاقا من غير قصد فلا معنى لتعيين العدد على الأصح. After discussing why he chose to use the word tariq, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah now returns to the intended subject matter of the discussion, and that is a mutawaatir narration, which is based upon the number of channels and pathways through which a hadith reached us. By commencing with mutawaatir, we can already notice how Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah changed the order from other scholars. Ulama ibn Salah rahimahullah, for example, commenced with the topic of sahih, authentic narrations. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, وَتِلْكَ الْكَثْرَةُ أَحَدُ شُرُوطِ التَّوَاتُرِ. The numerous chains are one of the conditions of tawatur. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah does not provide a formal definition or explanation of the term mutawatir, but instead begins by explaining a condition of a mutawatir hadith. We will first give a brief overview before proceeding further. To facilitate our understanding, we may consider the following: that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, then He could have sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in an era where there was internet, so that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could have held online programs which could be broadcasted to millions of people. These programs could have also been recorded to facilitate the spreading of the Prophet ﷺ's message, and in that case the duty of the scholars would merely be to ensure that the live broadcast and recordings are not tampered with. If not in an era of the internet, then if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, He could have sent the Prophet ﷺ in an era where at least tape recorders existed, so that people could record the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Here too, the duty of the scholars would be limited to ensuring that the recordings are not tampered with. If not even in an era of tape recorders, then if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, He could have sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in an era where publishing houses existed, so that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could have written a detailed encyclopedia consisting of all the laws of Islam, and that huge manual could then be mass produced for distribution throughout the world. However, in His divine wisdom, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to a predominantly illiterate nation. Not only were the people of that time deprived of all of these modern methods that we mentioned, most of them could not even read or write. In fact, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself could not read or write. Thus, in order to facilitate the preservation of this religion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed numerous scholars in the early stages of Islam with brilliant and excellent memories. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam uttered a statement, their memories were sufficient to preserve his words. Additionally, since the companions witnessed the actions and the speech of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam firsthand, they could easily ask the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for clarity if there was any confusion. To spread this knowledge, the companions memorized the statements and actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and transmitted what they memorized to the next generation, that is to the tabi'in. The tabi'in also relied mostly on their memories to capture knowledge. In the latter part of the era, Imam Zuhri rahimahullah was tasked with writing, but overall they too had to rely on memory. This was until the generation after them. In this manner, narrations were transmitted via trust, and it was essential that everyone had a good memory coupled with integrity and credibility. However, at the end, everyone was human, so the possibility of errors and mistakes remained. They may have had good memories, but they were still fallible, isn't? And they could slip up. Therefore, the scholars would look at many factors before deciding whether to accept or reject a narration. For example, if a narrator did not possess a very good memory and he alone was narrating a particular report, the scholars would exercise caution before accepting that narration. On the other hand, there were some narrations that were narrated by many people in every generation. Although this removed the possibility of error, there remained a possibility that all of these narrators could have had a common interest, and hence they fabricated the narration. Thus, the scholars would investigate whether it was possible for all of these narrators to collude upon a lie. Once they confirmed that it was reasonably impossible for such a large number of people to all agree to fabricate a report, they would then examine whether there was such a huge amount of people narrating in every era, in every link, or only in that one particular link, in that one period. Together with that, the scholars would also examine the content of what was being narrated. For example, were the first group of people mentioning something that could be perceived with the five senses, or were they stating something that was beyond the senses? In the case of Hadith, were these narrators saying that they heard or saw the Prophet ﷺ, or were they merely mentioning some assumptions, conjectures, or thoughts? If the first group, that is the Sahaba, mentioned that they clearly saw or heard from the Prophet ﷺ, and many of them narrated it to a large group of people from the next generation, and all of the narrators were probably in different parts of the world and from different backgrounds with varying interests, then it would be difficult to assume that all these narrators conspired to fabricate a narration. Furthermore, if these huge numbers of people in turn narrated to another large group, then logically it would be very hard to doubt such a report. It is this type of report that the Muhaddithin termed as Tawatur or Mutawaatir, and they attach great regard for such a narration. Once you understood this explanation, we may now look at the term itself. So the literal meaning of tawatur is succession. In Lisan al-Arab, Ibn Manzur said, وَالتَّوَاتُرْ التَّتَابُعُ. Tawatur is succession. Allama Munawi rahmallah said, التواتر لغة تتابع الشيء فرادة. Tawatur linguistically is the succession of a thing singularly. From these definitions, it is understood that it makes no difference whether the succession is consecutive and immediate, or whether there are intervals and pauses. However, when we turn to the definition that others gave, we note that their definition was qualified. So this led to a difference of opinion concerning whether tawatur refers to a normal succession or whether it refers to a succession that has intervals. Ibn Manzur explains this by saying, وَقِيلَ هُوَ تَتَابُعُ الْأَشْيَاءِ وَبَيْنَهَا فَجَوَاتْ وَفَتَرَاتْ. So he uses the word qila, which is a sighatu tamriz. Sighatu tamriz means that he used the majhul just to indicate to the weakness of this view. So that denotes that he did not agree with this view. Likewise, Ibn al-Athir rahmallah mentioned in an-Nihaya that وَالتَّوَاتُرْ أَن يَجِيءَ الشَّيْء بَعْدَ الشَّيْء بِزَمَانٍ ويصرف تترى ولا يصرف فمن لم يصرفه جعل الألف للتأنيث كغضبة ومن صرفه لم يجعلها للتأنيث كألف معزة. In درة الغواص في أوهام الخواص, Hariri puts a lot of emphasis on using the word tawatur only if there are intervals. And he indicates that those who use it in any other way are wrong. He says ويقولون للمتتابع متواتر فيوهمون فيه لأن العرب تقول جاءت الخيل متتابعة إذا جاء بعضها في إثر بعض بلا فصل. So basically the word mutaba'a is used if there is no interval. But if you have something that happens and maybe after a while there's like a small interval and then again another thing takes place, then you would use the word tawatur. Likewise in as-Sahah, Jawhari says والمتواترة المتابعة ولا تكون المتواترة بين الأشياء إلا إذا وقعت بينهم فترة. So he's mentioning that there has to be that interval. Then only you can use the word متواتر. وإلا فهي مداركة ومواصلة. If there is no interval, there is no interval, there is no break in between, then it is mudaraka and muwasala. In ilm al-urud, in the science of poetry, they probably considered this when presenting the definition of tawatur as كل قافية فيها حرف متحرك بين حرفين ساكنين. This here is the al-qawafi of أخفش al-awsat, that it is every rhyme in which there is a letter with a haraka, with a dhamma, fatha, or kasra between two sakin letters. Looking at the usage in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Al-Mu'minun in verse number 44, ثُمَّ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا تَتْرَى. Thereafter we sent our messengers successively. If we take the meaning of tawatur in accordance with those who state that there has to be an interval and pauses, then this verse will mean that there were gaps between the different prophets. Hariri claims that indeed this will be the meaning. وَمِمَّا يُؤَيِّدُ مَا ذَكَرْنَا مِنْ مَعْنَى التَّوَاتُرِ قَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى ثُمَّ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا تَتْرَى وَمَعْلُومٌ مَا بَيْنَ كُلِّ رَسُولَيْنِ مِنَ الْفَتْرَةِ وَتَرَاخِ الْمُدَّةِ. So he's saying that this is a proof to show that the word at-tatra mutawatir is when there are gaps in between, when there are pauses, when there are intervals, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent one Rasul, thereafter there was a gap, and thereafter Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the next messenger. However, scholars of tafsir did not specify that this verse hints to intervals between the messengers. Now, since this is not a lesson of tafsir, we will look at the commentary of a scholar whose tafsir was relied upon by all those who came after him, and that is none other than Allama Tabari rahmallah, and we will confine ourselves with what he mentioned. So he said, يقول تعالى ذكره ثم أرسلنا إلى الأمم التي أنشأنا بعد ثمود رسلنا تترى يعني يتبع بعضها بعضا وبعضها في أثر بعض وهي من المتواترة وهي اسم لجمع مثل الشيء. So this is all that he mentions. He just mentions that one messenger followed the next. He did not mention anything about there being an interval or there being a gap between the various messengers. And he brings quotations from Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu, which merely also only shows a succession. So the first goes حدثني علي قال حدثنا أبو صالح قال حدثنا معاوية عن علي عن ابن عباس قوله ثم أرسلنا رسلنا تترى يقول يتبع بعضها بعضا. And he brings various other asanid which all prove the same. None of them show that there was intervals or gaps. Allama Najmuddin al-Tufi, a scholar who passed away in the year 716 Hijri, he mentioned in Sharh Mukhtasar al-Rawda that هذا يظهر منه أن التواتر التتابع المتدارك بغير فصل. So now this is in contrast to what we just mentioned earlier, that Hariri used this verse to prove that there was intervals, and he is using the same verse and proving that there is no intervals. So he's saying that هذا يظهر منه أن التواتر التتابع المتدارك بغير فصل is continuous succession without separation. It is very clear that there should be no interval, and claims that even if a person wanted to assume that there were intervals between the prophets, then too he cannot establish that from this particular verse. فأما فهم الفصل بين الرسل من قوله سبحانه وتعالى ثم أرسلنا رسلنا تترى أي واحدا بعد واحد فليس من اللفظ بل مما ثبت من الفترات بينهم، والذي أجده يتبادر إلى الذهن من المتواتر أنه المتتابع المتدارك والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم. He said that as for assuming that there was separation between the messengers, there were intervals due to the verse ثم أرسلنا رسلنا تترى, then this is not due to the word tatra, rather it is due to other factors that establish it. And after he says وَالَّذِي أَجِدُهُ يَتَبَادَرُ إِلَى الذَّهْنِ, I feel that the meaning that immediately comes to mind when using the word tawatur is continuous succession. Ultimately, lexicographers began to say that this term is broad. Whether there are intervals or not, the word tawatur could be used. Feroz Abadi rahimahullah said وَالتَّوَاتُرْ التَّتَابُعُ أو مع فترات, mentioned in Al-Qamus al-Muhit. The tawatur is continuous succession or with intervals. So he uses the word أو. The same is also in Taj al-Urus. والتواتر التتابع تتابع الأشياء أو مع فترات. As you can see, here is again mentioning أو مع فترات وبينها فجوات. That tawatur is continuous succession of things or with intervals and gaps between them. As for the technical meaning in the field of hadith, it is simply putting together the conditions that Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions later. To understand this before we actually define it, you should take note of the following, that Ibn Hajar rahmallah just notified us of the various books that were written before him in Usul al-Hadith, and he mentioned that only a few, that he's mentioning only a few of them, and he admitted that there were others as well. However, if a person has to go through all those books, he will find that there were only two scholars who discussed the concept of tawatur, and that is Alama Khatib rahimahullah and Alama Ibn Salah rahimahullah. As Ibn Hajar rahimahullah was writing this book at the beginning of the 9th century, that means that although many centuries had passed, only two scholars had spoken about tawatur. So it is on this basis that Orientalists such as G.H.A. Joinball criticized Muslims for placing so much emphasis on mutawatir. And they argue that Allama Ramawur-Muzi rahmallah, Imam Hakim rahmallah, and all the other earlier scholars, they made absolutely no mention of tawatur. So Joinball further claimed that Ibn Salah rahmallah is the one who actually discussed tawatur briefly. He discusses it on page 267 to 278 in his Ulum al-Hadith, and Ibn Hajar rahmallah is the one who refined the term and clarified it, but still he did not officially define it. Thus, Orientalists object that the term tawatur was not properly defined even in the 9th century. However, the truth is that mutawatir is actually part of aqidah and usul al-fiqh. Even though Ibn Salah rahmallah brought the chapter of tawatur, he clarified that it is not part of ulum al-hadith. He said, وَمِنَ الْمَشْهُورِ الْمُتَوَاتِرِ الذي يذكره أهل الفقه وأصوله وأهل الحديث لا يذكرونه باسم الخاص المشعر بمعناه الخاص وإن كان الحافظ الخطيب قد ذكره. So you can see he's mentioning that it's a topic of usul al-fiqh. It has nothing to do with ulum al-hadith, and therefore scholars of hadith do not discuss it. Scholars of usul al-fiqh spoke about tawatur in the 3rd and the 4th century. Although he did not mention the word tawatur, there is a statement of Imam Shafi'i rahmallah in Ar-Risala wherein he says ووجدنا أهل الفتيا ومن حفظنا عنه من أهل العلم بالمغازي من قريش وغيرهم لا يختلفون في أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال عام الفتح: لا وصية لوارث ولا يقتل مؤمن كافر، ويأثرونه عمن حفظوا عنه ممن لقوا من أهل العلم بالمغازي. فكان هذا نقل عامة عن عامة، وكان أقوى في بعض الأمر من نقل واحد عن واحد، وكذلك وجدنا أهل العلم عليهم مجتمعين. Now this statement of Imam Shafi'i rahmallah, some scholars deny that it could be used to establish tawatur. But if you have to look at it closely and you understand it properly, then it definitely can be used. Because the narration which he is using, La wasiyata li warith, it is a weak narration. But looking at the fact that it was transmitted by such a large number of people, who in turn narrated it from such a huge amount of people, who also narrated it from lots of people, then this makes it much stronger than a narration that is narrated from a single person who narrated it from a single person. Likewise, JHA Joint Ball forgot about Allama Khatib rahimahullah, because he mentioned in Al-Kifaya, فَأَمَّا خَبْرُ التَّوَاتُرِ فَهُوَ مَا يُخْبِرُ بِهِ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ يَبْلُغُ عَدَدُهُم حَدًّا يعلم عند مشاهدتهم بمستقر العادة أن اتفاق الكذب منهم محال، وأن التواتؤ منهم في مقدار الوقت الذي انتشر الخبر عنهم فيه متعذر، وأن ما أخبروا عنه لا يجوز دخول اللبس والشبهة في مثله، وأن أسباب القهر والغلبة والأمور الداعية إلى الكذب منتفية عنهم، فمتى تواتر الخبر عن قوم هذه سبيلهم قطع على صدقه وأوجب وقوع العلم ضرورة. But even if Orientalists argue that they are just one or two isolated statements, we say that it is a chapter of Aqidah and Usul al-Fiqh. If a person is to look through the earlier books of Usul al-Fiqh, he will find numerous scholars long before Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, and even long before Allama Ibn Salah rahimahullah, who used the term. Now the reason why we have to discuss all of this is because tawatur, in terms of application, it is on par with Quran. You can use tawatur to establish aqidah, and therefore if you are demolishing tawatur, then you are demolishing an important branch, an important source of Sharia. So therefore we need to stress upon this, and we need to highlight why it is so important, and we need to prove that there were earlier scholars who mentioned this term. Otherwise it would mean that now later scholars are fabricating something, they are innovating something, but this here is actually proven from earlier scholars. So we will inshallah discuss the Hanafi outlook on tawatur, when we quote from very early scholars. For example, Allama ibn al-Jassas al-Razi, so he lived between the year 305 to 370 Hijri. That's the 4th century. He spoke about tawatur in his book Al-Fusul, and he quotes a lot about it from Isa ibn Abban. And he passed away in the year 221 Hijri. He was a direct student of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah. So you can already see now we're going back to the 3rd and even to the 2nd century. Similarly, Allama Bazdawi rahmallah and Allama Sarakhsi rahimahullah, who were from the 5th century, they also transmitted statements from Isa ibn Abban regarding mutawatir, and they themselves also went into detail concerning it. Just before them, Allama Dabusi rahmallah, he elaborated on mutawatir. So the point here is that many scholars of Usul al-Fiqh spoke about mutawatir, and Ibn Hajar rahmallah himself acknowledges this later on. Now, keeping all these points in mind, that mutawatir is a term of Usul al-Fiqh, and scholars of Ḥadīth after Ibn Hajar rahmahullah formulated the definition based on all what Ibn Hajar rahmahullah mentions here. We will go through the text and then we will give the definition of the muhaddithin. So Ibn Hajar rahmahullah is saying, وَتِلْكَ الْكَثْرَ أَحَدُ شُرُوطِ التَّوَاتُرِ, that for there to be these multiple and huge amount of chains, this here is one of the fundamental conditions of mutawatir. إذا وردت, when a narration appears like this, بلا حصر عدد معين, without a limit of a specified number of narrators, بل تكون العادة قد أحالت تواطؤهم على الكذب, rather it is normally impossible for such a large number of people to collude and secretly agree upon a lie. وكذا وقوع منهم اتفاقا من غير قصد, and likewise it cannot be coincidental that they agreed upon this lie. فلا معنى لتعيين العدد على الصحيح. So there is no reason to specify the number according to the correct view. Now here there is a lot of repetition in the text, and this might cause some confusion. The reason for the repetition is that many times Ibn Hajar rahimahullah would add the notes of his students to the book that he was writing. And this here is illustrated and proven from his book Fathul Bari. So that could be the one reason. Alternatively, another reason for the repetition may be that since Mutawaatir was regarded as a chapter of Usul al-Fiqh, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah realized that students of Usul al-Ḥadīth would not find much information on this term in the earlier books of Ḥadīth, since, as we just mentioned, only Alama Khatib rahimahullah and Alama Ibn Salah rahimahullah discussed the term. Thus, it is possible that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah wanted to explain the term properly, and hence the repetition to facilitate the understanding for the scholars of Usul, for the students of Usul al-Hadith. However, this repetition is not what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah does in the remaining portion of this book. Now, looking at the text, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah uses the word tilka to indicate on the amount of chains, and then he says bila hasri adadin muayyanin. That is, that this large amount is not specified. There is no particular number. We cannot say that if it's 5 chains, if a narration is transmitted through 5 chains, then it will be mutawaatir, or through 10 chains, or maybe even through 70 chains. We cannot restrict the number. So here you can see that he's using the word bila hasr. These words simply mean that the large number is not confined, it's not restricted, it's not specified. In Usul al-Fiqh, scholars use the word la yuhsa, which means something is unlimited, it's countless. There is a huge difference between something that is not specified in contrast to something that is unlimited. Because if something is you will explain and say that something is unlimited if there is a really large amount. So to understand this, assume that there are 4 books lying on a table. Now to describe this, you won't say that there are countless books. Even if there are 40 books or even 400 books, you still would not say that there are countless books. In order to accurately describe something as countless, there has to be a very large amount that it is difficult to ascertain specifically. So, if you want to use the word countless, you will use it for the amount of stars in the sky. Then you will say that there are countless stars. So the point is that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah uses the word bila hasr, which means that there should be a lot of narrators, but the number does not have to be in the thousands. In fact, it can even just be a few, and it could also be confined, as long as a person attains firm conviction when he hears the narration. So even though Ibn Hajar is saying that it should not be defined, Mullah Abdul Hayy Laknawi explains, after quoting from Ibn al-Malik, we'll discuss that later when we explain the Hanafi ruling. So he says, وَحَاصِلُهُ أَنَّ مَدَارَ التَّوَاتُرُ حُصُولِ الْعِلْمِ الضَّرُورِ بِنَفْسِ الْخَبَرِ سواء كان عدده محصورا أو غير محصور. You can see in a contrast to what Ibn Hajar just mentioned. Ibn Hajar said بلا حصر, and Ibn Abdullah al-Laknawi is saying سواء كان عدده محصورا أو غير حصر ولا يشترط عدم الحصر. وإليه أمال بعض شراح شرح النخبة عبارة ابن حجر. So he's saying that there's no contradiction with what Ibn Hajar mentioned. Rather, he's saying that some commentators have also explained the text of Ibn Hajar rahimahullah in a way to show that the number could be confined. So he says that some commentators they explain that معنى قوله بلا حصر عدد معين أنه لا يشترط فيه حصر العدد المعين وليس معناه أنه يشترط فيه عدم الحصر. So then Mullah Abdullah Laknawi comments and he says وهذا توجيه حسن, that Ibn Hajar is merely saying that you don't have to confine the amount. He's not saying that it's prohibited to confine the amount, and he's saying that هذا توجيه حسن. So scholars of Hadith will accept the least amount of narrators as long as a person can get firm conviction and as long as it's more than 3. So this here is a major difference with scholars of Usul al-Fiqh, because when scholars of Usul al-Fiqh speak about Tawatur, they are talking about literally countless people. We'll inshallah quote the examples later, and you will understand what the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh had in mind when they spoke about Tawatur. Another point to be noted here is concerning the word Hasar. This word is used in Nuzha an-Naḍar and it is a mudaf. And the mudaf ilay is the word adad, which is a word used in Nukhbatul Fikr. So in Nukhbatul Fikr, the i'rab would be different. And now you have a word from the commentary that is changing the i'rab in the original text. So this here is Ibn Hajar's unorthodox method of joining the two books. And this is a method that has invited criticism, but nevertheless, since both books are his, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah could do as he pleases. He says, بل تكون العادة قد أحالت تواطؤهم على الكذب. That generally it would be very hard to assume, it will be very difficult to assume that this great amount of people secretly agreed to make up this lie. So this now is the beginning of the second condition. It is not an explanation to show how large the number of people should be, because if that was the case, then Ibn Hajar rahimahullah would have used the word bi'anna, and he would not use the word bal, because the word bal comes in the meaning of intiqal min ma'nan ila ma'nan, a transition from one meaning to another meaning. Whereas the word bi'anna or the word bi comes for sababiyya, and that is cause. Ulama al-Laqani rahimahullah said al-zahiru anna bal huna lil intiqal, that apparent it seems that the word bal here is for transition, so that means moving from the first condition to the second condition. Likewise, Ulama Wajiuddin al-Gujarati, he said فَكَلِمَةُ بَل لَيْسَتْ لِلْإِعْرَاضِ وَإِنَّمَا هُوَ لِمُجَرَّدِ الْإِنْتِقَالِ. In short, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned one condition, and by saying bal takun al-ada, his objective is not to explain the first condition, but rather he is mentioning a second condition. It is important to mention this here because on the next page he says إِذَا جُمِعَ هَذِهِ الشُّرُوطُ الْأَرْبَعَ, when these four conditions are combined. So he's using the word for. That word هَذِهِ has to have a marja, an antecedent, a place of return. And Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is saying that there are four conditions which have been mentioned. So if we take the meaning bal to be an explanation of the first condition, then we will only have three conditions. So therefore, Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah said, فَيَتَحَصَّلُ أَنَّ الْكَثْرَ هِيَ الشَّرْطُ الْأَوَّلِ وَإِحَالَةُ الْعَادَةِ هِيَ الشَّرْطُ الثَّانِي. The clause of impossibility of them agreeing on a lie is such that at times it will be due to an extraordinarily large amount of narrators, but at other times it will be fulfilled with a smaller group who are higher in rank. Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah explained this and he said لكن التحقيق أن الإحالة العادية قد تكون من حيثية الكثرة من غير ملاحظة الوصفية. So just lots of people, you're not taking into consideration their description, whether they are pious, whether they are trustworthy. Rather there's such a huge group of people, so you understand that they can't be lying. وقد تكون بانضمامها. He's saying, but sometimes you will take into consideration the description of the people, the profile of those who are mentioning it. كما إذا روى عن العشرة المبشرة مثلا 20 من التابعين، فإنه لا شك أن العادة تحيل اتفاق الأولين على الكذب ولا تحيل اتفاق العشرة من التابعين عليه ولو كانوا عدولا. وكذا إذا نقل 20 من المفتين والمدرسين مسألة يحصل العلم بهم ما لا يحصل بما ينقل 20 من الطلبة أو 50 من غيرهم. فالمدار الأصلي في باب التواتر على الإحالة والإفادة دون اعتبار العدد والعدالة. نعم، قد ينضاف إلى العدد وصف يقوم به الإحالة فتحصل به الإفادة. Then Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, وَكَذَا وُقُوعُهُ مِنْهُمْ اتِّفَاقًا مِنْ غَيْرِ قَصْدٍ. Likewise, it cannot be coincidental that all of these people are mentioning the same thing, even though they did not intentionally agree. Allama Qasim rahimahullah pointed out here that there was no need to use these words which denote upon the same meaning. He said, اتفاقا يغني عن قوله من غير قصد. When he says coincidental, then he doesn't have to use the word من غير قصد, that unintentional. فلا معنى لتعيين العدد على الصحيح. Hence, there is no reason to specify the amount according to the correct view. In conclusion, there are two conditions that have been mentioned thus far concerning tawatur. The first is that a large but unspecified amount of people are narrating the report. And the second is that generally speaking, it would be impossible for such a large group to collude upon a lie. And it is also far-fetched for them to coincidentally say the same thing, because probably they are from different places, and also they do not have a common agenda, etc. A quick example to illustrate this is that if you did not go to a particular country, say you did not go to Argentina, you will still believe that there is a country called Argentina. Why? Because such a huge number of people mentioned that there is a country like this. They have been there and they met the inhabitants. It would be impossible for so many people to agree to make this up. And this huge amount of individuals cannot have a common interest by lying and say that they have been to that country or they met people from that country. Therefore, we have no doubt in trusting and getting even firm conviction that there is such a country. We are so sure that if someone denies the existence of Argentina, we will regard them as ignorant or even foolish. Now, this is what tawatur is all about. If a huge group of people inform you of something, but they have a common interest, then this will not be tawatur. Hence, even though you have such a huge amount of media houses claiming that something took place, and they are all from different areas and various backgrounds, it is still not regarded as mutawatir because of this common interest which they all might have. With that, we will inshallah conclude this lesson. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka.